Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. I'm a human who cares about supporting other humans. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We'll unpack the experience with them, where they've been stuck, what it feels like, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others. I believe that when we feel more connected and seen, magic can happen. And remember, if you find yourself sitting on a comma in your life, you can also talk to me without a microphone. To explore coaching with me and getting off the comma in your own life, check out my information and book a call with me at offthecomma.com. And I'm also doing something different. I'm curating my own sponsor community, local businesses and professionals who I handpick and who align with our vision here. Be sure to check them out, learn more about them on my website and my YouTube channel. In the meantime, let's get into this week's conversation. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Off the Comma, and we are midsummer 2024. Man, this year is really flying by. And I'm really excited this week because we're going to be talking to Cameron Law, who is somebody who's really new to my circles and I've really just recently met. And we're doing some kind of work together in a professional capacity. So I'm going to shut up and hand it over to you, Cameron. Cameron Law, welcome to the podcast. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Start with how would you like to be known and a little bit about yourself.
One, thank you for the opportunity, Paul. I'm excited to be on the show. I go by Cameron Law, and I would love to be known for my core values, which are love and service. That's how I show up. Ultimately, I stand for love and service for the entrepreneurs, and both in my personal and professional life. And I think as I tie that to my core traits that I try to bring out into the world is really be empathetic. And I think that that's a key component to love and of being of service. And then also just being that continual person. And so having that dedication to show up on a regular basis and support those around me. So that's how I would like to be known, and ultimately the legacy I would like to leave.
Nice. I really appreciate the theme of empathy in there as well. That's definitely something that resonates with me. Tell everybody a little bit, whatever you're comfortable with, a little bit about what you do or what you enjoy doing.
Terrific. So I lead a Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and I think really at a high level. My passion is around building the greater Sacramento region into being the best place that it can be. I found entrepreneurship to be a driver from that in a couple lenses as I look at entrepreneurship. We talk about entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit to create value for others. When we create value for others, we empower ourselves. And so as I take kind of my leadership mindset, it's about serving those people around us, but it starts with identifying a problem in a way to ultimately create value. And so it's how can I bring my unique perspective of the world and understand that I also need to identify a way that someone else might be looking at a potential problem, and then how might I be useful and valuable to them in creating a solution. And so I believe that, if we really empower the entrepreneurial mindset in our region, we can unleash our potential as a community, but also then from an economic development lens is when we build businesses, we create jobs and ultimately build a thriving community through that as well. So that's really my passion. And I get to, have the joy of leading the center here and working day to day with entrepreneurs who are building their businesses, but also getting to tell the story about what's going on in our region and how we truly are becoming this hub for innovation and entrepreneurial activities in the region. So I get to do that in all different spheres. And that's kind of what my core driver is. Outside of that, I like to keep myself busy. I'm currently training for a marathon. So I'm going to try to do my first marathon, which is the California International Marathon. I often try to go for some of those different feats here and there. And I think that just keeps me busy outside of work, but have a lovely partner who I married in November. She and I's been high school sweethearts. So we got married on our 13th year dating anniversary, and we've loved to ultimately be growing together and building the life that we live. So that's my joy outside of my professional career.
I see kind of in all the things that you've shared with us, kind of this innovation, as you talked about, and also kind of like pushing boundaries, stretching yourself, blazing new pathways, and so forth. I really, literally jumped out at what you said was the phrase that had to do with how other people can approach problems too. And it seems like, that really patches into your empathy and being able to kind of like put yourself in the shoes of others.
100%. Yeah. I think, when we talk about the entrepreneurial mindset and kind of being an entrepreneurial leader, you really have to bring in that mindset of how other people are experiencing a situation, right? We can't bring in a solution without understanding maybe the way in which that solution impacts them. And then also based on their lived experience, how that ultimately might impact them in that given moment, right? And so the successful entrepreneurs that you ultimately see can build that connection with whether that be their beneficiary, if it's something like a nonprofit organization, or if it's their actual paying customer. They need to understand the nuances of those needs. And ultimately, when those needs arise, where do they go and who do they reach out to, and who kind of, validates that those pain points are there and different things. And so the more that we can connect with that, I think the more that we can ultimately advance our work. And then I think also as an entrepreneur building a team, you have to be empathetic with your team members as well and understand how they're showing up on a regular basis. And that, if things are going on at home, that might impact the way that they're, working in the workplace, and how can you ultimately support them in all of those different facets.
Well, you're clearly very passionate about what you do and the things that you do. So I'm looking forward to hearing your story and hearing about your experience with sitting on and getting off of a comma. You haven't shared your story. This is very consistent with all of our episodes, right? I usually don't ask to hear any details about the story beforehand, because I like to hear it for the first time, just like the listeners are. Before we actually get into the 5 questions that structure the podcast, I always like to ask this question as well. So Cameron, as you think ahead to the next 40 minutes or so of this conversation and sharing your story, what intention would you have for yourself?
Well, I think that's a great question. And as I look at it, I think continuing to tell my story. And I think for a long time, I wasn't always as open about sharing that. And as I have gotten to the Carlson Center, I have a awesome team member who's kind of helped push me in telling that story. And a lot of it was to build better connections with our students and the entrepreneurs that we serve. And so, she's really helped me in continuing to foster that. And I think every time I have those conversations, the more I connect dots that I didn't see for myself. And so I think my intention is maybe I'll also walk away with connecting a dot that I hadn't connected prior as I explore the story further. But I appreciate the opportunity to go there. And, I think a lot of it too is, I feel like a lot of times when people are going through a challenging time or they're on the comma, they might not have the language to articulate what that was. And so oftentimes I feel in having the different opportunities to share my story and kind of lean into that, I associate new language, and because I ultimately am becoming more aware of the nuances in relation to what that was like. So
I love that. And so I want to support your intention to be able to tell the story and to connect, but also to potentially articulate it in new ways. My intention is to create the space for that for you. And also that in other people hearing your story out there, someone or someones will hear your story. They'll actually resonate with your story, connect with it, maybe feel a little bit more connected, a little less alone, and in the best of cases, inspired and empowered to maybe take some action that they've been waiting to do something with. So
perfect. Well, thank you for supporting in that as well. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's jump in. So the very first question, Cameron, is where in your life have you found yourself sitting on a comma?
Yeah. So probably want to provide a little bit of context of the timing of when I felt like I was on the comma. And that was when I was doing my undergrad at UC Davis. So a big part of my history leading to UC Davis and through it was being a baseball player. So I played baseball all the way up and through college, or at least my undergrad. And that was a real defining element of who I was. I was always kind of the baseball player, and my dream was to play professional baseball. And as I ended up going into my junior year, I signed basically a partial scholarship to go to UC Davis. and I hurt my elbow. So I wasn't able to play my whole senior year, but had, they were honoring my scholarship as I was going into my freshman year at Davis. And so as I was there, the coach that recruited me ended up leaving. And so I was kind of let with a whole new set of coaches, or at least to a degree, the main head coach was not the person who recruited me. And, going from, high school to then Division I and then not playing a year, you can imagine some of the challenges and jumping to that next level of competing. And so one of the things that I was challenged with was ended up developing the yips. And I don't know if you're familiar what the yips is, but basically it's when, how I've kind of come to realize is your brain goes into flight or fight mode and some of the basic functions of the game. And so for me, it really came out in the fielding element of it. So it was less of the pitching. I was a pitcher, and it came out more of when I would do pitcher fielding practice. So throwing to first base or picking over and some of those things. And so it really hindered my ability to ultimately play. But a lot of that stemmed from, it was kind of the first time in my life where I had a coach who didn't really believe in me. And I went into one of my fall coach meetings and ultimately, a short way to sum it up was he told me he didn't want me on the team. He wasn't someone that recruited me, but they honor the scholarship. And his recommendation was that I would leave UC Davis and go to community college and try to work my way back. And so kind of, there was an uphill battle that I saw myself ultimately in trying to play for this individual who I didn't maybe necessarily have the connection with. And so I put continued kind of pressure on myself through that time. And I think a lot of that led to the yips. And one of the challenges, with that is it's things that I could do when I was, 6 years old. And I was struggling when I was, 18 to 22 years old and doing it. And they're the most basic functions of the game. And so I had a lot of shame around not being able to do that. And one of the challenges that I often ran into was I still felt like I was a leader, but I was kind of met at the crossroads of it was easy to lead when I was kind of the person providing to the team in terms of the ace pitcher and doing things like that, like when I was in high school. But when I wasn't an active contributor in the way of being on the field, I found it challenging. How do I lead in a way when I'm not the kind of main person out doing the things on the field? And so I found other ways to create value for my teammates. And a lot of that was being there to pick them up when they were in challenging times. And then also, being at the first one at the field, usually to help set up things so to make it easier for our team and ultimately showing up. And so, for me, I was kind of at this crossroads of where I had a dream to play professional baseball, but then, really realized that is that something that I can do? And the other piece of context that I would share in there was when I would go play summer ball. So this was, when I was at Davis, and then in the summers, we would go play in other leagues. So I moved up to Reading and moved to Humboldt, and I would be an ace pitcher again. And I would be that person who was kind of that successful pitcher. But then whenever I came back to Davis, I just reverted back to the yips and that struggle. And so I dealt with a lot of anxiety and kind of a day-to-day of showing up at practice and things of that nature. And so, I ultimately, set a personal goal was, to be the best teammate and most inspirational. And we had an award, it's called the Scott Heinig Award. And so that was kind of my goal, was that could be a way for me to create value and ultimately show up for my team in a way that I thought was impactful. And, I think one of the challenging things for me as well was I would sometimes not make the travel squad. So, it's easier when you're a freshman, sophomore, not to travel, but when you're, much older on the team and you're not traveling, there was, I would sometimes go home and, Davis isn't too far from Sacramento. And I really realized how so many people identified me as the baseball player, because I would go back and be at the gym and everyone asked me, how is baseball? And it was like, well, I'm not traveling with the team, so obviously it's not going very well. And I would never say that because I'm not that type of person. But no one ever asked me how school was going or how my girlfriend of multiple years was going. And so I found that identity that was challenged was continually reinforced time and time again. And so, ultimately, for me, that was kind of the time I was on the comma, was, going through that experience and still holding on to maybe a dream to play professional baseball when, maybe it's time to hang up the shoes and ultimately transition to something different. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to reflect a couple of things back and acknowledge you too. I mean, such a challenging situation. I mean, you shared some really kind of powerful words in there, shame and identity, but the things that you described in all of this, having this kind of dream, as you said, then like right at the outset, like having all the circumstances change to now make it difficult for you to pursue the dream in terms of like your injury. Then the players who kind of facilitated, supported you in the dream all change. So it's like the players on the board change. So now you don't even necessarily have this support system. I really kind of what stood out to me was the coach who basically had it all figured out for you, right? This is what you're going to have to do. This is what you, without really consulting you at all. And then, you talked a little bit, and we'll unpack that some more, about the ways that you became resourceful in that. But let's talk a little bit more about, what that was like for you, what that must have felt like for you, because it sounds very challenging. I mean, the whole thing that you were set up to do ended up kind of, sounds like falling apart or falling away. And then that left you here at that point.
Totally. And I mean, I always love these things because it's like hindsight's 2020, and ultimately, is a pinnacle point for me to get to where I am today. But I think one of the things is I often reflect back on it. And to your question was, I think one of the biggest learnings, and I still remember, chatting with my parents about it, was, when I felt comfortable to share more about what I had gone through and kind of what that meant, was I ultimately had given my personal power away to someone that I felt like dictated whenever I was in any environment with this individual, whether it was at our golf tournaments or whatever that might be. Like my body reacted in a way that just like was flooded with, I wasn't like really there to operate in the way that I normally would be operating. Mm-hmm. And so I realized that how that impacted me. And so it was like, trying to be intentional as I go forward, as how do I create space for others as well as a leader, and not have that same thing where I might, impose on someone in a way that I felt I was, but then also in relation to my own journey was not holding myself, as much to someone's personal power as I had. So. Actually,
I'd love to jump in for a moment, and I might do that from time to time. I might interrupt or as I reflect things back, just know that they're always just what I thought I heard. So correct me. But so now this is two different examples that you've given of. In this, you've got these physical manifestations. You've got the yips, and then you just talked about giving your personal power away, and then you were describing kind of some physical things that would come up for you, sensations or whatever the proper word is, right? When you were around this other person, what was happening? What was manifesting for you physically and in your body in these times that you're describing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that this is maybe the point where I'm maybe connecting new dots. Was I don't necessarily have the language at it, but it would be, I mean, some of the things that, are vivid for me I would show up to, our practice, say, started at like 11:30, I would probably get there at like 10:45, 10:30 or something, just to like, I was so anxious to see what was on our agenda for practice. And a lot of it was, if the agenda did not have PFPs, which is pitcher fielding practice, I like my body was relaxed, and I was like, oh, I can show up and, warm up, and I don't have to worry about doing this thing that I like felt like was a life or death type thing. And I know looking back, and like, even then, like I wasn't going to like die in that situation, but it felt like I can't do it. For whatever reason. And, you try to trick yourself into saying you can, but I didn't feel like I certainly was able to. And then the other side of that was, if it did have pitcher fielding practices, like, okay, I'm going to go start warming up and try to like, run or get some of this energy out so I could be more tired or relaxed to ultimately get through that situation. And so I've always been someone who I didn't shy away from like hard work. That wasn't like necessarily something. And I mean that more in the sense of, I would go to the field at like 9 o'clock at night just to throw the ball into a net to practice doing the fielding practice. And so it's like, I was willing to put that work in, but I realized it wasn't a physical thing. And I hadn't matured in a way where I felt like I had the mental strength to work through some of those things. And so I never really had to rely as much on the mental game, because I think the physical element, I was able to carry myself for so long, to where then when we would say the game speeds up, I don't know that maybe I had that capacity. And so, so, I mean, in terms of how that manifested, I think it was just a, sense of nervousness, and, you feel like your blood's going and your heart rate's going and all that good stuff. So,
and you said anxiety earlier. I'm just curious. And again, we're just unpacking stuff, right? And if there's nothing there, then that's okay too. Sometimes on the podcast, I feel like I'm kind of going on a hunt for something. And that's not necessarily the case. Maybe it is. Maybe we'll talk about that on my episode, right? But what was the anxiety about? I mean, I understand. I'm not an athlete. I never did athletics at any point in my academic or professional career, right? So I could make assumptions. We know that there's anxiety that comes all the time, with any kind of sport. But for you, what was the anxiety?
Yeah, and I only could connect this like reflecting back. And it's funny how like random things make you connect certain dots. And so we were watching out enough. So Ryan Reynolds, and I can't remember the other person. He's from like Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The two of them bought a team, like a football team. So like a soccer, and I think it's called Wexford or something of that sort. And they had this episode, it's called Bromance. And it was all about how men actually, for the most part, and I'm being very generalized here, so I recognize that, but have a more difficult time connecting with each other in terms of like love and relationship without sometimes a sport. And so you see oftentimes that men connect through sports, particularly through like, hey, you give a pat on the back, or, hey, I love you, brother. Like, you did great out there. Right. And so we connect a lot of times through that. And that was a core part of who I was and how I felt like I brought value to my family as well. A lot of that is, I still remember I was 10 years old and got a call from my grandfather after I made a like diving catch to win the game. And, he called crying of how proud he was of me. And I can still I still remember picking up the phone and having that conversation. And so it was like, for me, I wasn't living up to what I felt like I could ultimately bring. And so ultimately, one of the things that I was working towards day in and day out, I wasn't having that connection because I didn't feel like I was being successful in that work. And so I think that being tied to my identity of not being successful, and then that connecting to, I think the people around me and how I thought they saw me, and I could be, projecting what I saw in myself as well. And so that I felt like there was that kind of tension as I look back, and not that they did anything. It was more so of how I felt versus, having the maturity to maybe have the conversation that I would now ultimately have. So.
Sure. It seems like, I think what's coming up for me is as you're describing these things, kind of like this element of like falling short or not contributing as much as you wanted to. I mean, is any of that kind of part of this? Or
yeah, totally. And I mean, one of the things, and this has come up more recently, my wife and I, there was one of those like games as you you ask the other person, maybe it was basically fill out the blank, and it was like, who would spend $1,000 without asking a person, blah, 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 all good fun. But the last one was like, what's your biggest fear? And like, I knew what hers was, and I never really asked myself that question. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm, for transparency on here, I'm afraid of scuba diving and like being underwater, those types of things. I was a good swimmer, but like that, it wasn't like that fear that it was asking, right? It was more of like your emotional element of it. And so, when I really, thought about it while we were, going through that exercise game type thing, my fear was that I'm not enough. And a lot of that was like, I think tied to, trying to work through, I'm a younger brother. So I've always looked up to my older brother and, competed with him, whether he knew I was competing with him or not. And so, no, it's not that anyone did anything. I think it's just, I would say partly being a younger brother and always wanting to strive to do more and be more. And so I think, that I think contributed to wanting to excel in the sport itself. Right. And that was like a way that I could contribute, and how people, whether, I'm right or wrong, saw me maybe contributing in terms of that. Right. And I think the examples of when I would come back and, go to the gym and people asked about that, but not the other things, right? That was like where they saw potential value creation from me, versus other elements.
Well, and so, I mean, thank you for sharing that. And boy, that hits deep, that those three words, I'm not enough. Right. And how do I want to phrase this? Like, within what you shared, what I'm seeing is there's this element of what you want to be, and then what people are recognizing you for, and there's not all, those aren't always aligned. I mean, I'll go to the second question, and we can go back and forth too. Okay. As you talk about this comma that you've been sitting on, and we've been unpacking this a little bit, like, what, you've answered this a little bit, what did it create for you as you were in this situation broadly? Like, what was it creating for you?
I mean, it was just a lot of uncertainty. I think part of it was like, am I doing the right things? And then I also, I think it, came at a time in my life where I wasn't like super mature. And so I think, if I think back, if I had that happen now with, say, a boss or something who talked to me in the way that my coach did, I would have reacted likely different. But I was a 18-year-old, kid, I would say, and I didn't know how to take it. Right. I never had a coach like that, or never had that situation. And so it was kind of like, I just took it and said that that's the way that it is. And, I'll continue to work hard, but if I'm not, seen in that certain way. And so, I think that, I put a lot of extra energy into things that I continued to dive deeper into the sport and try to figure out how to beat it. But, I felt like my now wife, she was my girlfriend in college. She was kind of the one person I felt like I could go to in relation to that. And like she was no baseball expert, but came to many games. And, she was, always there to like hear that out. But I didn't really feel like I had many other people to go to. And oftentimes if it was like, oh, well, like, come on, you did this when you're 6 years old or whatever. Right. And so it wasn't really, I wasn't, I even tried to go to like a psychologist, and I still remember it wasn't a successful venture, I would say. And a lot of it was trying to like reflect back of like, think of the last time you enjoyed the sport. I was like, I can't think of the last time I enjoyed the sport. It was like, at some point it felt like a job, and a job that I wasn't really enjoying.
Yeah.
But like, I felt like that was what people around me wanted me to continue to do.
I remember more clearly what I was thinking earlier. What I was kind of noticing, I think, is like there's this element of being seen, right? Like it's important for you to be seen. You talked about striving to do more, be more, and then you've also talked about, the things that people think they're seeing you for, which was the things that you set out to do and be. And then these coaches who, and these other folks who are critical, and they're not seeing you. It seems like people aren't seeing how you're experiencing the situation. They see the story as you maybe had originally intended it to be written, but they're not seeing you as you're actually going through it, as you're actually experiencing kind of the frustrations, the discomfort, the disappointments, the letdowns.
Yeah. And I recognize part of that could be the role I played, right? And I think going forward, a lot of it is, ultimately, yes, people can do certain things to make, you feel better, but ultimately I was the one who went through that. And I guess what I'm trying to say was I imagine there's a component of back in the day saying, oh, all is good, and not wanting to communicate that, right? One, maybe not having the language nor the confidence, and nor really like wanting to have that conversation. Right. And so, I'd say part of it is like, for the first couple of years, I didn't maybe label that, oh, I'm going through the yips or whatever that might be. I didn't want to like own that was a thing, because it made it more real, and that like, oh, I'll get over it, or maybe it's just a physical thing, versus it being mental, right? And then actually claiming it and then trying to work through it. So I would, part of it is I do want to obviously own that, like, I didn't also always probably portray that I had those things going on, as well. And so I think there's a balance there of like, people seeing that you're struggling, and probably those that would be on the field with me seeing it, visibly, versus, what maybe is shared outside. Cause it was like, I didn't want my life to be 24/7 that, as well. So,
well, and thank you for saying that, because that kind of clarifies for me. So, you there was a degree of deflection in there. It sounds like you didn't want necessarily people to see that you were struggling.
Yeah, for sure. You're dead on with that. I think probably later on I was more open to sharing it, and I think it was like there's only you can only do it for so long, I guess. And then part of it was like at that point it was more so of like, okay, I'm doing other things to add value to the team, and so it was less of like, how do I was kind of like, you kind of was like, all right, this is how it is. I still don't, if I'm honest, is like, I don't really love the sport anymore. And it is what it is, I guess.
You say you didn't love the sport anymore. Say more about that. Did you really not love the sport anymore, or was it just not the same sport for you?
Yeah, it's a good, I think to that point, it's probably not for me. And I guess I enjoyed like obviously elements of it, but it was like not being able to do it. I guess it brings back so much of that like emotion, that it doesn't bring up the like creative thinking around it or other things that I felt like I was able to bring to it. I also like a good buddy of mine from high school. Like he's in the pros now, and I got to see like one of his first games when he came back to play the Giants. And it was just a happenstance. A buddy from Australia was visiting, and I was like, hey, let's go to, he was going to be in San Francisco. I was like, well, hey, let's go to, a Giants game, America's pastime or whatever. And it happened to be the game that he was first playing back in Northern California. And like talked to him before the game and saw him have a successful game. And it was like interesting to like see someone that I played with in high school, and then played against in college, then like on the biggest stage being successful. And it was like, I realized how maybe close it could have been. There's obviously many people who've, not gone on to play. But it also, is like, oh, like, I mean, these people are spectacular athletes, but it was, also not maybe as far away as I maybe would have thought it was.
So let me go into the third question, and obviously you can kind of go back and forth and elaborate. What did you learn about yourself as a result of sitting on this comma?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things as I reflected back on it. I think one, I really developed kind of empathy at its core for me. I think going through that struggle, and then also not probably a ton of people knowing that I was going through that. I realized that, there's a lot of times people are going through way more challenging things than I have ever gone through. And if, I can create space and, help hold that for others as they might be experiencing a challenge or, trying to pursue their own goals and dreams, that I want to hold that and hope along that process. So I think that's been core. And then also that, always great to be a contributor, but there's other ways to create value than maybe just the straight path that might be, I think of, for me in a sport, it seems pretty clear of like, okay, you're either like, you're doing good pitching or hitting, right? But it was like, I found other ways to add value to the team. And again, I would say there's things that I thought was adding value of like, hey, helping set up things so it made it easier for them to come to a game. Also, I, was unique at trying to pick pitches and other things where, there might be multiple innings where I was, basically picking the other coach's signs. So then we knew what pitches were coming. And so it's finding ways to be creative with skill sets, and ultimately versus just, watching the game and being there, I wanted to be an active contributor in whatever way that I could. And so I think always trying to find ways to add value to the people around me in a less direct way, I think would be one of the key things. And, I would say, I'm trying to continue to work on probably being more open about how I'm feeling about things. I don't know that I'm always still there. So I'd say that's still a work in progress. If I'm, as I'm being truthful with that for sure. But, I think that that's a key thing as I go forward.
You kind of bring something up too that is a really interesting observation, right? A lot of times when we think about or we see examples of empathy, it's because we know what someone's been through, they've shared what they've been through or whatever, and then people can kind of put themselves in the shoes of the person for what they've experienced, right? And you really kind of reflect another side of it, which is I know what it's like, and again, correct me where I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But this also side that like I can empathize because I know what it's like to not share it. I know what it's like to hold it in. I know what it's like to not want everybody to know about it, which is also it gives you a different angle or a different perspective of empathy, right? Because usually it's like, oh, somebody went through this thing or had this illness and then there's empathy because we can relate to that. What I believe I'm hearing from you is that, yeah, I know what it's like to not necessarily want that to be visible. I know what it's like to be carrying something and nobody does know about it or it's not shared.
Totally. I think that you're definitely correct on that. And I think I often try to bring that out when I talk to people so I can elicit their stories as well. And so help them kind of work through uncovering whatever that might be and sharing that for, I don't know if it's their first time but being open to sharing and holding space and, non-judgment for that as well. So I think, trying to be that, and, it's not every day that I do that, but oftentimes it's, when you're talking to entrepreneurs, if I'm tying it back to, my profession is, oftentimes they're taking big risks to build something, and that could be a restaurant, it could be their technology, whatever that might be. And so like, I can only best help them if I know really where they're at in that process. And a lot of it is like, we can go and, put on the show that, hey, this is going well. I'm, might be getting customers and those things. But if you're telling a story that's not what's actually going on, there's no way that I can actually truly help you get to that next thing if I don't know what that is, right? And so it's oftentimes of like, hey, how are getting to understand where they're at versus like, tell me the process, where's the business versus tell me how you're doing in relation to what that looks like. And so I'm able to feel like uncover that, which I think allows me to probably better understand where the entrepreneur is in their process of starting and growing the business.
Yeah, it's this metaphor just popped into my head. It's like painting over wallpaper, right? If you can peel the wallpaper off and the paint comes with it. If you don't paint the wall, if you don't get to the wall surface underneath, then the paint won't stick, right? Sure. And that comes up a lot for us as coaches too, right? This is the thing I want to fix or solve or what have you, and you get into it and you kind of help facilitate them to getting to the answer, but then there's something underneath it that is actually a more honest truth. And that's really the thing that presents the opportunity to go and look at. And because if all you do is fix the surface, the problem persists or repeats, right?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Cameron, what changes for you or what has changed for you as a result of sitting on this comma?
What has changed for me? Well, I don't go play baseball anymore. But no, I say that as like, it was a really pivotal point. And I think what it it allowed me to find, I think, a passion outside of a sport, really is a key element. And I mean, it ultimately led me to, I think, ultimately where I am for a variety of ways. I think one, I realized early in my time at Davis that I wasn't going to make it to the MLB. And so, but I still held on to that dream of some level of professional baseball. And so I was like, okay, maybe I could play in a foreign league. And so I held on to that until about my senior year, and then realized, okay, I'm kind of just holding on to that. But I saw that, maybe I can go study abroad and figure out kind of who I was and what that ultimately looked like. And so that led me to moving to Brisbane, Australia, where I pursued my master's of business. And that time, I really, focused on who I was and, what I wanted to do. And I really found my passion for Sacramento. And a lot of that was Brisbane's a lot like Sacramento, built along a river, two great universities. And, but I saw a vibrancy there that I hadn't yet seen in Sacramento. And that's kind of been my personal passion. And so I think ultimately it led me to that experience and being open to exploring and, building kind of the next version of me, I guess I would say, and continuing to be open to that journey. And, I think what oftentimes I always saw was like there was a lot of energy put into like physical things. And I still do that. As I said, I'm training for a marathon and other things, but it was like, how do you put that energy into being a learner and other elements? And I did decent at Davis. I, was I had like a 3.0 and, wasn't exceptional by any means. But I was never a big reader or any of that thing. And so moving and kind of figuring out that next step, I really got into reading. And, I set a goal when I moved there to read a book a month and maintained that. And that really kind of opened my eyes to leadership and a variety of, from entrepreneurship to whatever it ultimately might be. And so I found a lot of what reading did for me was give me language to be able to speak to the experiences that I had gone through, and then also what, I was currently experiencing early in my professional career and now. And I think, as I look back, there are certain things that, I wouldn't say I totally repeat the same things, but I am able to connect dots and see when I'm, doing similar things. And I oftentimes still have my identity associated with what I do. And I recognize that there's privilege in that as well, right? Where, as a white male, that I can associate my identity with the jobs or things that I do. There's privilege in that for sure. But I also recognize that if I'm seen by what I do and it's not successful as well, then there's kind of that all wrapped into it as well. So, but I think as I, moved off the comma, I think there was a lot of learnings and reflecting back of what were some of those skill sets and things that I want to continue to be. And as I, try to lead in a variety of ways, how do I show up for others as I wouldn't have wanted to be the leader that, ultimately was around me then.
And it seems to, correct me if I'm wrong, but okay, so being able to play baseball in the pros was a thing that was just not going to be attainable anymore. That was gone. Okay. And yet it seems like if that was a container or a shell of a thing, you were able to reach inside that and find the essence of what you, or at least some or one of the things that you wanted to do as a baseball player, and pull that forward into the new future where you threw yourself all in. You said, okay, if that door's closed, let me go out and open a whole bunch of other doors and explore a whole bunch of other doors. But it seems like you pulled something forward with you. There's an essence of what you've been describing with leadership and modeling and exploration and so forth that would have showed up in your role as a baseball player had that been the path. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of it ties to like my core values, I think are probably what I would most associate with some of that. And, a quote that I saw when I was 13 years old, and it was on my, my MySpace, maybe shows who I was when I was younger. But the quote goes is, give everything you got, what you keep, you lose forever. And I always held that like super true. I don't have any tattoos, but if I got one, that might be the quote that I would, tattoo. And a lot of that was, I always saw that as an energy element of it. So give everything you got, what you keep, you lose forever. And I, recognize that you can only give, so much energy in every given moment. And so I think that that's something as I look at service and, how I would say, servant leadership and looking at love as an element of that, that's probably something that I pulled through was like, how did I support the people around me, even when I had, at times little to give in terms of energy. I found ways to do that. And, still I felt like added value to the people around me as I have less of those challenges or anxiety or certain things. You have more energy to give, and how am I expending that energy. So I think just being conscious of what that is. And yeah, I think those would be the through line that I would have maybe pulled out of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that too, and I appreciate the bringing that through line thought even more clear for you in a way that it seems like it's very strong. Fifth question, last question, Cameron. What does getting off the comma look like for you?
Yeah, so I think it was felt with like exploration was really the path forward. So when I moved, I didn't know anyone in Australia, and so I was kind of exploring, who I was and what I wanted to be. And I think one of the key elements and during my time there was I really realized how baked in that being an athlete would have had value if I hadn't moved abroad. And I say that because if I graduated and stayed in the United States, I would have likely been on a path to be in sales or something of that nature. And a lot of that's because people see Division I athlete, they see like, oh, you're a competitor, you're, goal oriented, and you would like that's the usual path that I would see people ultimately fall into. There's a lot of, I guess, as I would have like applied for jobs, that would have been the story that I would have told was, oh, I'm a Division I athlete, blah, 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 blah. Versus, when I moved to Australia, no one really cared that I played Division I baseball. They didn't know what that meant. Baseball wasn't a big sport there. So it wasn't like, it didn't have any, I use the word value, but it didn't really hold much weight in a professional setting there. And so I had to like quickly gain experiences. I didn't have my summers were off playing baseball, not, doing internships and other things of that nature. And so I had to gain a lot of experience. And so I kind of was open to just learning and putting energy into all of these different areas to ultimately figure out, one, what I most enjoyed, but also what I can, be impactful in people around me. And so I, did a lot of work in that space to kind of figure out who I was. I trying to get back into it, but I was, I had a pretty good journaling practice and was really introspective. And, one of the books that really catalyzed me was The Start With Why, and really asking that question of like, why do we do the things that we ultimately do? And, I kind of found my personal passion of, Sacramento and what the community means to me. And I think the opportunity that I saw to bring a renewed energy and perspective to the community. And so I've found that opened me up to be more open to the pathway to making an impact than it was like particular jobs, right? It wasn't being the pitcher of the team. It was being a way to continue to grow and ultimately, have an influence and impact at different levels on that kind of vision that I wanted to have. And I think that's allowed me to go from, working at a venture capital firm to a nonprofit to now in academia. It's all in the same vein, but I'm open to the path that it ultimately allows me to go within that space. And so I think that's kind of one of the elements of being off of it, was less maybe constricted in what that looks like versus it being open to the possibilities.
Well, and there's something really cool in what you said. You described something and defined something in a way that's very different than I think I've heard it so far. Every story brings its own layer, its own angle, nuance, right, to the experience of being stuck and getting unstuck. But boy, this is really powerful. So this is what I heard you say. When my past as an athlete and as a baseball player was no longer going to be my future, I took steps to go and explore what other futures could be. A lot of times when people will tell that story, they'll say, oh, let me just see what's next, right? But you described it very clearly in this element of, let me not only go explore what's next, but let's also do it so that I don't get, my word, pigeonholed into what it means to be an baseball player. I mean, there's something really powerful in that, because it's not saying that's what people have to do, but when one door closes, you can literally go and explore your options so that that door doesn't have to be attached to you, going forward and forevermore.
Yeah. And I think it allowed me to just think more, think differently around what, and the word that kind of comes to mind is expansively to a degree. And a lot of that wasn't, I'm driven by like, hey, here's a potential. I call them like vehicles to ultimately have a different impact, right? And so I'm open to what those vehicles might be versus like, if you looked at like to get to a professional baseball player and pitcher was like, okay, you go from, Division I, you get drafted, you go into the minors, and there's a clear pathway to what that looks like versus like, if I just want to make an impact and change in my community, there's many different vehicles to doing that, and being open to ultimately exploring what that pathway might be, and kind of defining that more myself as I go through it. I think I've set some guides of what I think that might be, but I think it has allowed me to ultimately be open to what those next elements are.
Mm-hmm. I have one last question for you, and then we'll wrap up. And it's because I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit more on this, and because you've been very clear, very strong messaging here about, impact, empathy, contributing, leadership, love. But you use the phrase add value a lot in your story and in this conversation. And I think you've already answered the question, but what else would you say to describe what add value means to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. What comes to mind for me is there's two, I guess it's one thing of energy. And then I think it's two things of like showing up and doing work. And I think a lot of it is, in a, professional setting, it's sometimes like, hey, there's like obviously work involved for what we do. And oftentimes, say it's supporting an entrepreneur, it's, a lot of conversation, but it's building relationships with people and opening, connections for them to navigate that process more quickly. And so when I look at it, it's just being there for people. And like, it's less of my, I always talk to people around me as like, I'm not like the smartest person in the room by any means. But I feel like I can build relationships and connections fairly quickly with people. And that allows me to establish trust and ultimately help people along that journey, both the individual that I'm directly serving, but also that network of relationships is valuable to them. And so when I speak of adding value, it could be me asking the right question to help them unlock something that they were stuck with, or allows them to uncover something that then says, oh, here's a great resource, or here is a person that you should go talk with, right? And so when I think of adding value, it's those lenses versus like me being like a source of knowledge. It's kind of the connection and inspiration to continue on in that pathway, and being that trusted source to like share what they're going through, I think is how I would look at adding value. So I think it's a partly of consistency and showing up and being there to have that conversation. I'm pretty accessible, to a degree. I have a calendar link on our one, it's in my signature, but also on our, on our website, and, you can line up a time anytime on my calendar. And, oftentimes that's exciting to have those conversations, but it's being open to have those and ultimately try to find ways to support them. And so it's less of it being a prescripted way of adding value. I think it's just being there to hear what they're going through and seeing how I can help them navigate that process.
I so appreciate that. And thank you for elaborating on that, because I'm self-referencing for a moment, especially in the influencer space and the wellness space, the kind of self-improvement, self-help space. A lot of people are out there talking about adding value, adding value, adding value. And I have had this moment where I'm like, what the hell do they mean by that? Because that's also a term you hear a lot in corporate and in kind of profit-driven circles. And so I personally, I can't speak for anybody else, have had a tendency to be like, okay, well, so that once again, that's an extraction term, right? Like you're only worthwhile if you're here giving something to somebody else, but you completely reframed that for me. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for the question. I hadn't really explored it myself. So I appreciate it.
Well, I mean, it's an important phrase for you because you use it a lot, and there were a couple of times where I was like, I want to ask him about this. And then boop, there was the door. So
thank you.
Cameron, let's wrap it up. So as you look back now over the past 40, 45 minutes or so, what would you acknowledge yourself for?
Acknowledge myself for?
Mm-hmm.
So one, yeah, I think that's a good question. I think just continuing to tell my story, and I've gotten more comfortable with it, but it's not always like the easiest thing to do, and go back and kind of, not that I'm anxious or nervous now, but obviously you kind of go back and relive to a degree what some of those things are, and so I one, appreciate the opportunity to continue to tell that, and I hope to have an impact on someone where maybe they feel like they can go share that with someone, and ultimately continue on. And as I look back at that, I wanted to, there's a lot of people who did support in getting off the comma, and particularly my wife Katie. She's always been there for me to support in that, and continues in our life together. So I'm appreciative of that, and always being there to support me and tell me I'm enough, which is great as well. And then I think of just as I reflected back, there was a lot of resources that I leaned to that kind of had me pose the question. So I know some of those readings of Start With Why by Simon Sinek was something that I had always reflected to, and I actually whenever we've had family members or people around us graduate from high school, I always give them that book. I don't know that they ever go and read it, or maybe they'll read it later on, but it was such a impactful book for me to ask, why do I do what I do? And a lot of it was I don't know how in depth you know about the Simon Sinek, but I always found the what, how is often how we talk about we introduce ourselves, what we do versus ultimately why we do it. And so I try to do that differently when I work with students. So and then
Well, Cameron, where can people find you if they wanted to reach out, or maybe ask you more about your story, or just kind of see what you're up to? And again, I'll put the links in the show notes here, but tell us, where would you like people to find you?
Yeah, so I'm most active on LinkedIn, as where I'm mainly active. I would say feel free to shoot me a LinkedIn message, but I would say on there is if you connect with me, my email is on there, and I'm most responsive via email, but would love to connect and see what you're working on and how I can support you, whether you're an entrepreneur or leader, and working to better our community. So would love to connect there. And then, I do have an Instagram and Facebook, but I would say for the most part, LinkedIn is where I'm quite active, and would love for you to engage the Carlson Center. So if you're an entrepreneur looking to build your dreams, Carlson Center, CARLSEN Center at Sac State. And on there, we have our team, and would love to have you connect with us and support you in your journey. So those would be some of the ways I would say to connect.
Well, and that's actually a bridge over to acknowledgments. So this is something we do in every episode, where it's part of what we do with the podcast, which is lifting up voices, giving people a voice, letting people be seen and heard, right? And also for you, because it's part of your story, the acknowledgments is basically anyone in your circle that you'd like to give a voice to, or boost, or promote, or lift up. And that can be organizations, creators, individuals in your life. So who would you like to acknowledge?
Yeah. So one, just I acknowledged her earlier, but Katie is definitely someone that, she's always been a steadfast supporter of me. So I appreciate that. And obviously my family, who's afforded me a lot of opportunities to explore and get to where I am today. And I think, as I have gotten to where I am, I've certainly had, mentors and people who've been there to support in other ways. And one, Gordon Fowler with Threefold Communications has been a big support. And then, I would say Dale Carlson, the founder of the Carlson Center, who saw me for the leader to come in and support in realizing his vision, and give me the platform to continue to support entrepreneurs in a larger way in our region. And so I'm just thankful for our team as well. So I'm certainly don't do it alone. And we have an amazing team with Arlene, Jesse, and Brian. And so I'm just thankful for all of them. And there's a lot of resources I could share in terms of, leadership and entrepreneurship. And one of the books I'd reference again is that Start With Why is a great one. And one that for those that are servant leaders and givers out there, I highly recommend Give and Take by Adam Grant. It's a really tremendous book that looks at kind of you as a giver and helps you protect yourself from those that can take from you, and recognize that that's certainly part of the journey. And I think it's a great book for self-awareness if you certainly are a giver. So those would be a couple of my recommendations, but I appreciate the opportunity to do the acknowledgements.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Cameron. And again, thank you for being here with us and sharing your story with us. It's a great add to our community of storytellers. And obviously, you and I have some things that we're working on off the microphone. So we'll have more conversations off the mic, and just appreciate you coming to being on the show today.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be on the show. And did want to give a quick shout out and thanks to Natalia for connecting the two of us. So I'm excited to have connected and, in a short time, get to share my story with you and, be on the show here. So hopefully I add value to the community that's listening, and for those that get to hear my story and know that I'm here to support.
Yeah. And I appreciate you acknowledging Natalia too, right? Because everything is all about connections. Natalia was actually episode 49. So she aired just a couple of episodes ago. And as people who have been listening regularly to the podcast will see, so many of the folks who come here, we're all connected through these varying ways, right? And so just continues to reinforce the power of connections. And, some people will say, oh, it's all about who you know and everything. And it kind of is, right? Like there's ways that can be used advantageously, and don't be afraid to leverage your network. That's what your network is for, right?
Totally.
Nice. Have a great rest of your week, Cameron.
All righty, you too. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
What an honor it is for me to witness these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way too. Think about what you learned from this conversation. What stood out for you? What challenged you? What inspired you? And I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling and reflection. Surprises can reveal themselves to you when you do this. And if you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. Let's spread the word. Let's continue to build connection. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Be sure to like this episode, follow the podcast here on this platform and social media at Off the Comma, and feel free to comment and interact with these posts and episodes. Check out my website for workshops, events, and my sponsor community. I'm covering the costs of production by curating my own sponsors who align with our vision. Be sure to check them out. They're all powerful people and businesses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.